The bright lights of the television studio beamed down onto the stage, illuminating the sleek, modern set where one of the most watched talk shows in the country was about to begin. The audience buzzed with excitement, eagerly awaiting the special guest of the evening, Melania Trump. Despite having kept a relatively private life after her time as First Lady, Melania's public appearances always drew immense attention. Her elegance, grace, and composed nature made her a fascinating figure, and tonight's interview was supposed to be a discussion about her recent philanthropic work. She had just launched a new initiative to support foster children, something she was deeply passionate about. But David Coleman, the talk show host, had something else in mind. Known for his aggressive interview style and sharp tongue, he prided himself on pushing his guests to their limits. And tonight, he saw Melania Trump as an easy target, someone he could mock, interrupt, and embarrass in front of millions watching at home. As Melania walked onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. She was dressed in a white designer dress, exuding her signature grace and poise. She smiled softly and waved before taking her seat across from Coleman. From the moment the interview started, it was clear that Coleman had no intention of keeping things professional. Instead of discussing her charity work, he immediately launched into condescending remarks about her past, her accent, and even questioned her intelligence. "Melania, I have to ask," he said, with a smirk, leaning forward. "Do you actually write your own speeches? Or do you just smile and read what's handed to you?" A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Some viewers at home might have found his remark amusing, but many cringed at how openly disrespectful he was being. Melania, however, didn't flinch. She maintained her composure, her expression unreadable. "I always speak from my heart," she replied calmly, her Slovenian accent thick, but her voice unwavering. "Maybe you should try that sometime." The audience gasped. The energy in the room shifted. Coleman, clearly caught off guard, forced a laugh. He wasn't used to guests standing up for themselves so directly. "Oh, come on," he continued, rolling his eyes. "Let's be real, Melania. You are the First Lady, sure, but you weren't exactly elected. You just happened to marry the right man. What do you really know about politics, about the real world?" Now, the audience fell silent. This was no longer playful banter. This was a direct attack. Coleman was trying to diminish everything Melania had ever done, reducing her identity to just being someone's wife. The camera zoomed in on Melania's face. She blinked once, her expression still calm, but there was a shift in her posture. She slowly leaned forward, locking eyes with Coleman. "David," she said, her voice steady, "you seem very comfortable insulting me. That's fine. But if you think my life has been easy, if you think I have not worked, struggled, or earned my place at the table, then perhaps it is you who has a small mind, not me." A wave of applause burst through the audience. Some people even stood up, clapping loudly. Coleman wasn't expecting that. He opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in his career, he had nothing to say. And Melania wasn't done yet. She was about to give him an answer that would leave the entire world speechless. The energy in the studio had completely shifted. What had started as a typical late-night talk show segment was now something far more intense. Melania Trump had just turned the tables on David Coleman, the host, who had arrogantly assumed he could control the narrative. But now Coleman was clearly uncomfortable. He shifted in his chair, his smirk faltering, as the audience continued clapping for Melania's powerful response. Still, he wasn't ready to back down just yet. Okay, he said, forcing a laugh. "I suppose you have a point, but let's be honest, Melania. Your time in the White House was hardly groundbreaking. You weren't exactly a force in politics. I mean, what did you actually accomplish? Aside from, standing next to your husband?" The audience gasped audibly. It was a blatant attempt to dismiss her. He was trying to bait her, hoping she'd lose her cool stammer or retreat. But Melania did none of those things. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if she were considering his words. And then, with perfect poise, she leaned forward and spoke, not to defend herself, but to educate him. "David," she said, her voice unwavering, "I did not come here to argue with you, but if you are asking what I accomplished, then let me tell you." She paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "I created the Be Best initiative, focusing on children's well-being, online safety, and the fight against opioid abuse. I worked with hospitals, schools, and charities across the country, things that should matter to everyone, no matter their politics. But you wouldn't know that, would you?" She gave him a small, knowing smile. "Because it is easier for people like you to reduce a woman's work to nothing, to ignore what does not fit into your narrative." The audience erupted into applause. Coleman's face turned red. He hadn't expected her to fight back with facts. He opened his mouth to speak, but Melania wasn't done. "You say I stood beside my husband. Yes, I did. Just as many first ladies before me stood beside theirs. But I also stood for something bigger than myself. I stood for children in need. I stood for families struggling with addiction. And I continue to stand for those who have no voice. Now tell me, David, what do you stand for?" A deafening silence filled the studio. Coleman's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He had nothing to say. The audience exploded into cheers and applause, people jumping to their feet. Melania had completely flipped the script. She wasn't the passive, timid guest he thought she'd be. She had just turned his own show into his biggest embarrassment. Even the cameraman caught a few audience members wiping their eyes, touched by the raw honesty of her words. Coleman knew he had lost, but he had one last trick up his sleeve. All right, he said, holding up his hands in fake surrender. "You've made your case, but let's be real, Melania. You were never a politician. You weren't even born in America, so why should Americans take you seriously?" The room went dead silent again. Everyone knew what he was implying. Melania took a slow breath, her face unreadable. Then, for the first time in the interview, she actually laughed. A soft, genuine laugh that caught even Coleman off guard. And then she said something that would change everything. The moment Melania laughed, it was as if the entire studio held its breath. David Coleman was visibly taken aback. He clearly wasn't expecting her to have such a calm, poised response. But what she said next would be nothing short of transformative. "David," Melania began, her voice calm and collected, "I may not have been born in this country, but I chose it. I chose America because of what it represents, the land of opportunity, where anyone can dream and achieve, regardless of their background. And that includes me. I am here as a wife, a mother, and yes, as someone who has seen this country from both the outside and the inside. I've seen the struggles, the resilience, and the incredible potential that lies within every American." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The audience was stunned by her insight, her ability to rise above the pettiness of the host's attempts to tear her down. "You may want to dismiss me, David," Melania continued, her eyes locked with his, "but there are millions of people who are looking for a voice, someone who doesn't just talk about politics, but about real solutions. I have met mothers who are afraid for their children's safety online. I've talked to families torn apart by addiction. These people don't need cheap shots from talk show hosts. They need support." The crowd began clapping again, louder this time. But Melania didn't let up. She didn't just answer the questions that were asked of her. She drove a point home that no one could ignore. "As for my being born in Slovenia," she said, her voice gaining strength, "it's an incredible privilege to have experienced two different cultures. I know what it's like to be an immigrant, and I know what it's like to become part of something bigger than yourself. America opened its doors to me, and now I stand here representing not only my family, but the millions of people who come to this country in search of a better life." At this point, David Coleman was visibly sweating. He tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear he was losing control of the situation. He was the one who had hoped to make her the laughingstock, but now he was the one under the spotlight. "So, I ask you again, David," Melania's voice softened, but there was an underlying firmness in it. "What is it that you stand for? Is it mocking people who are doing their best to make a difference? Or is it genuinely helping the people who need it most? The room was dead silent for a long moment. And then, to everyone's surprise, David Coleman looked down at his hands, his usual bravado gone. He tried to speak, but the words didn't come. Melania had outclassed him, outspoken him, and most importantly, she had shifted the entire narrative. The audience was on their feet now, clapping so loudly that the sound reverberated throughout the studio. They weren't just clapping for Melania's words, they were clapping for the woman who had refused to be silenced. Coleman, unable to recover, gestured to the camera with a fake smile, clearly trying to save face. "Well, folks, I think we've heard it all for tonight. Melania Trump, everyone," he said, with a forced tone, though the lack of sincerity was evident. But Melania didn't need his acknowledgement. She had won the crowd, and she had done so with grace, dignity, and a resolve that no one could dismiss. She stood, nodded to the audience, and made her way off the stage, her head held high. The camera zoomed in on the stunned host, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. He had expected a confrontation, a slip-up, something to further his own narrative. What he had gotten, however, was a lesson in humility, and an audience that would never forget the moment Melania Trump took back her power. The conversation in the studio had turned into a silent one. No one needed to say a word. It was clear that Melania had spoken not only to David, but to the millions who were watching. She wasn't just a first lady anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. Melania Trump, with her unwavering composure and poise, has shown us just how to handle even the most challenging situations. She didn't just defend herself. She stood up for kindness, respect, and empathy in a world that often seems divided. It's moments like these that remind us of the power of grace and understanding, and how important it is to rise above negativity. I hope you feel inspired by Melania's strength and her message of unity. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others. Let's spread the message of positivity and support that Melania shared today. Until next time, take care.